You think carefully before you speak. Adjust your emotions to be appropriate. Weigh every choice to see whether it will be accepted or not. You still do everything as usual, but somewhere inside there is a part of you that always steps back, waiting for a reaction from the world before daring to move forward. Carl Jung believed that there is a very important moment in psychological life when a person begins to feel tired of always orienting outward. Not tired from failure, but tired from constantly measuring oneself by the world. And that moment is not a sign that you are losing direction, but a signal that it is time to turn back to yourself. This video does not teach you to ignore the world, nor does it advise you to cut yourself off from people. It simply guides you through a very deep journey from living by the external gaze to focus only on yourself. If you feel that this title touches something very familiar within you, it may not be accidental. Perhaps you are ready for a different way of living, one where you no longer need the world's validation to know that you are on the right path. Stay until the end. Because it is very possible that what you are searching for outside is precisely what has been waiting for you inside all along. Chapter 2. There is a very familiar stage in human life. Yet few people realize how dangerous it can be. It is the moment when you begin to feel that your worth rises and falls according to other people's eyes. A compliment lifts your mood for the entire day. Silence makes you restless and uneasy. A single unfriendly look is enough to make you doubt your entire path. On the surface, life still goes on normally. You work, you communicate, you try to fulfill your roles, but inside something very subtle is slipping away. Your inner center no longer resides within you. Carl Jung argued that the moment a person measures their self-worth by the external gaze is the moment they lose the deepest anchor of their psychological life. Not because others are wrong, but because you have handed over the authority to define yourself to something outside your control. At that point, inner life is no longer guided by the self, but is controlled by collective signals, looks, reactions, social standards. You no longer ask, "Is this right for me?" but instead ask, "Will this be accepted?" Jung did not view the desire for recognition as a moral flaw. He did not judge people for it. On the contrary, he saw it as a very natural sign of an unfinished developmental stage. When the self has not yet been established, when a person does not yet have a stable inner axis, they are forced to use the external world as a mirror to know who they are. Not because they are weak, but because they do not yet have a strong enough inner core to validate themselves. As Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Imagine a person walking through a forest without a compass. That person is forced to look at where the crowd is going. If everyone turns left, he turns left. If the majority stops, he stops. Not because it is the right path, but because he has no other way of knowing the direction. Jung called this state living by the collective map. You do not truly know where you are going. You only know that you do not want to be left behind. And it is precisely in this state that alienation begins. Alienation in Jungian psychology is not about doing something bad or living immorally. Alienation is when you live increasingly far from your true self while believing that you are being appropriate, fine, or up to standard. You choose a field of study because it is considered successful. You choose a lifestyle because it is admired. Each individual choice seems reasonable. But over time, you begin to feel empty and exhausted, as if you are living a life that does not fully belong to you. This is not a crisis, but the first whisper of the neglected self. I once met a man in his 30s who worked non-stop and was always praised as diligent and successful. But whenever he had free time, when no one needed him or acknowledged him, he felt empty and anxious. He stayed busy not purely out of passion but out of fear of that feeling returning. At the same time, he constantly compared himself with people his age and always felt slower, less accomplished, not enough. He did not realize that each comparison was a denial of his own unique process. A process that, as Jung emphasized, is never identical to anyone else's. Jung believed that each person has a very individual rhythm of psychological development. When you live by the external gaze, you force yourself to follow someone else's rhythm. And when that rhythm does not match your natural process, inner conflict emerges. Fatigue, disorientation, and the feeling of not living your own life are the consequences of that conflict. Focus only on yourself from Jung's perspective is not a call to selfishness or isolation. It is an invitation to return to the inner anchor that has been neglected. It is stopping the use of the external gaze to define who you are. It is beginning to ask what truly has meaning for me even if no one acknowledges it. When you begin to ask these questions, you are preparing to step out of the collective map and find your own compass. And the moment you suddenly realize that you have lived too long through the eyes of others, that is not a collapse, but a very gentle call from within. A reminder that it is time to stop, return, and listen to what truly wants to live through you. Chapter 3. Persona. The cost of wanting to be accepted. Number 2. Persona. The cost of wanting to be accepted. There is a very subtle moment when you begin to realize that you have lived too long through the eyes of others. And at that very moment, a quiet question arises. So, who exactly has been living in my place all these years? According to Carl Jung, the answer is often not other people, but a very familiar psychological structure that is rarely confronted directly, the persona. This is the social mask we learn to wear from a very early age in order to adapt, to be accepted, and to avoid being excluded from the group. The persona was not created to harm us. It was created to help us survive in the human world. The problem begins when we forget that it is only a role and start believing that it is who we truly are. Jung emphasized that the persona was never meant to carry meaning in life. It is a tool, not the essence. When you begin to seek life's meaning, a sense of existence and inner security through that mask, a very deep misalignment occurs. You no longer live from the inside out, but live to maintain an external image. And the tighter you cling to that image, the farther you drift from yourself. The fear of being judged is what gradually turns the persona from a tool into a prison. At first, you simply want to avoid trouble, avoid conflict, avoid being judged. You adjust your words to be tactful, suppress emotions to be appropriate, choose a safe way of living so as not to disappoint anyone. But over time, you begin to feel that you are no longer allowed to deviate from that role. Every divergent thought creates anxiety. The persona no longer protects you from the world. It protects the world from your true self. The fear of being judged is what gradually turns the persona from a tool into a prison. At first, you simply want to avoid trouble, avoid conflict, avoid being judged. You adjust your words to be tactful, suppress emotions to be appropriate, choose a safe way of living so as not to disappoint anyone. But over time, you begin to feel that you are no longer allowed to deviate from that role. Every divergent thought creates anxiety. The persona no longer protects you from the world. It protects the world from your true self. Jung warned very clearly about this when he wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." When you fully identify with the persona, you begin to live for an image rather than for inner truth. From there, a very subtle form of addiction emerges. Addiction to recognition. You need praise to feel okay. Positive feedback to believe that you are right. Not because you are selfish or shallow, but because you have placed your sense of worth into the mask rather than into the self. A friend of mine works in a creative environment and is always described as pleasant, professional, and a perfect fit. She knows exactly what to say in meetings, what to post on social media, and what image to present so as not to make anyone uncomfortable. But in a very private conversation, she admitted that she no longer knows what she truly enjoys. Every time she wants to do something different, she immediately hears a series of questions in her head. Will others find it strange? Will they be disappointed? Will they judge me? She is not living badly, but she has lived too long within the persona and has lost the feeling of living authentically. Her anxiety does not come from failure, but from having no place left to take the mask off. Focus only on yourself in this context does not mean rebellion or abandoning all social roles. Jung did not encourage blind destruction. Focusing on yourself here means beginning to recognize what is persona and what is self. It means daring to see that certain aspects of how you live exist only to be accepted, not because they arise from inner truth. And when you begin to loosen the persona even slightly, anxiety appears because you are leaving a long familiar zone of safety. But Jung believed that this anxiety is not a sign that you are going the wrong way, but a sign that you are touching truth. Each time you do not perform perfectly or fail to maintain the old image, you feel uneasy. But alongside that unease, another feeling begins to form. Lighter, more real, more alive. You do not need to remove the persona all at once. What Jung suggested was not to destroy all social roles, but to stop allowing the mask to govern your inner life. When you begin to focus on yourself, you learn to listen to your inner response before considering others' reactions, to allow yourself not to be recognized in small moments in order to preserve inner honesty. And from that gradual withdrawal of attention from the outer world, a quiet yet profound rebalancing begins to take place. If while watching this you suddenly realize that you have lived very correctly but not truly lived, that may not be a coincidence. Leave a comment sharing your story. It does not need to be perfect or fully explained. Just a fragment of truth you have carried for a long time. Sometimes daring to write it down is the first moment the persona begins to be set aside. Chapter 4. Comparison as a form of denying your individual path. Number 3. Comparison as a form of denying your individual path. When you begin to loosen the persona and no longer live entirely to be accepted, an old reflex immediately arises: you look sideways. You observe whether others are moving faster or slower, what they have achieved, where they are on the path of life. And very often you fall into comparison without realizing it. According to Carl Jung, that very moment is when a person quietly denies their own individual path in order to enter a race that was never meant for them. Jung asserted that no two psychological development processes are the same. Each person carries a unique unconscious structure and rhythm of maturation. Society, however, does not operate by that logic. It creates shared timelines. By a certain age you should be successful. By a certain age you should be stable. By a certain age you should have arrived. When you measure your life by those milestones, you stop listening to your inner process and begin forcing yourself to follow a collective schedule. Jung did not call this motivation but misdirection. Comparison from a Jungian perspective is not simply jealousy or insecurity. It is a much deeper psychological act. You are denying your own individuation process. Individuation is the path each individual must walk to become themselves. Not a successful version of someone else. But every time you look at others and conclude, I am slower, I am behind, I am not enough, you are unconsciously declaring your own path invalid simply because it does not resemble someone else's. This is a very subtle form of self-betrayal. Imagine someone running in a crowded race. At first, he only wanted to reach his own destination. But when he hears the footsteps around him, he begins to speed up, change direction, even stray from his original route just to avoid falling behind. Eventually, he collapses from exhaustion in a place that is not his destination. Comparison works the same way. When you live within a race, you expend energy on speed, while what you need most is direction. In a Jungian therapy session, a man once shared that for many years he felt he was behind his friends. They had status, wealth, stable families while he constantly changed direction, jobs, and goals. Each reunion left him feeling like a failure, as if he had missed something essential. But during a period of crisis when he was forced to stop, he realized that he had never been lost. He had simply been walking a different path. Slower in social terms, but deeper in inner terms. When he stopped comparing and began focusing on what truly mattered to him, the heaviness gradually lifted, not because he caught up, but because he returned to his own rhythm. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But you cannot become yourself if you are constantly measuring yourself against other people's lives. Comparison places you on a timeline that does not belong to you. It causes you to misjudge necessary phases of your own life, such as slowing down, getting lost, or even failing. Phases that for Jung are often essential to inner growth. In Greek mythology, Achilles is the greatest warrior. But he is invincible only when he follows his own destiny. When he seeks to prove himself through others' definitions of glory and fame, he steps outside the protection of fate and falls at his only vulnerable point. Through a Jungian lens, this is the image of a person abandoning their individual path to chase a collective image of success. And the price is always high. Focus only on yourself at this stage does not mean turning your back on the world or isolating yourself. It simply means stopping the use of other people's lives as the yardstick for your own process. It means understanding that not having arrived by society's standards does not mean you are failing, but may mean you are being prepared for a different kind of maturity. Forgetting others in the true Jungian sense means forgetting their timelines. It means no longer asking where am I compared to them and returning to the far more important question, am I aligned with myself? When you begin to focus on that question, the race dissolves. Not because you win or lose, but because you realize you were never meant to run in it at all. And it is precisely when you step out of comparison that your individual path becomes truly visible, clear, and alive just as it has always been. Chapter 5. Withdrawing projection. Who is really judging you? Number 4. Withdrawing projection. Who is really judging you? There is a very particular moment that occurs after you have moved beyond comparison and begun to question collective standards. It is when you realize that you are no longer chasing anyone. Yet the fear of being judged has not disappeared. You are no longer openly competing or comparing achievements, but a look, an ambiguous comment, or even silence can still make you feel scrutinized. According to Carl Jung, this is not a contradiction. It is a sign that you are standing at a deeper layer of the journey back to yourself. The layer where projection has not yet been withdrawn. Jung believed that most obsessions with being judged by others do not originate in the external world but in unacknowledged aspects of one's inner life. He called this projection the act of unconsciously attributing inner material to others. When a feeling or self-image is too difficult to accept, the psyche assigns it to someone else. We believe they are thinking about us, judging us, when in reality, it is the voice of our own inner shadow. Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The fear of being judged operates through the same mechanism. You may believe that others are being harsh toward you. But look more closely. Who is it that does not allow you to make mistakes? Who is constantly whispering that you are not good enough, not fast enough, not correct enough? Very often it is not anyone outside but a part of you, the shadow, the repressed and denied aspect of the psyche. When the shadow is not acknowledged, it does not disappear but continues to influence how you interpret the world. Let me tell you about a woman who was constantly worried that her colleagues did not respect her. She felt that every question carried doubt and every piece of feedback was criticism. But when she began to work deeply with herself, she realized that within her lived a strong belief. I am not good enough. That belief had never been spoken aloud. Yet, it was always present. And because she could not accept it as something that needed healing, she unconsciously projected it outward, believing that others were thinking it for her. When she began to confront her own self-doubt, something strange happened. The outside world seemed less judgmental. Not because others changed, but because the projection was withdrawn. From the perspective of modern science, this is not unfamiliar. Many studies in cognitive psychology show that the brain interprets ambiguous information according to existing beliefs. If you carry a schema of I am easily judged, you become hypersensitive to looks, tones, or unclear signals, and the brain automatically fills in the gaps with negative interpretations. Jung described this phenomenon long before contemporary research. The world you fear often mirrors what you have not yet dared to face within yourself. When you begin to integrate the shadow, allowing yourself to see and dialogue with the parts that were once denied, a crucial shift occurs. External voices lose their power. Not because you become indifferent, but because you no longer need others to carry your unresolved inner conflicts. You can hear criticism without collapsing and face disagreement without feeling threatened because you have taken responsibility for your own inner world. Focus only on yourself at this level is no longer about withdrawing from society or ignoring what others think. It is the act of reclaiming the psychological energy you have unconsciously given to the world. Each time you worry about being judged, that energy is projected outward. When you turn back and ask, which part of me is saying this? You bring that energy back inside. Jung saw this as the transition from living in reaction to the world to living in dialogue with oneself. Forgetting others in this context does not mean denying their existence but stopping the use of them as mirrors for unresolved inner conflicts. When you no longer need the world to carry what you have not yet accepted, the world becomes more neutral and less threatening. And in that silence, a new kind of freedom emerges. When projection is withdrawn, you stop asking, who is judging me? And begin asking what within me wants to be seen. And the moment you dare to stay with that question, you take a very deep step on the path back to yourself. And if in the final silence you realize that you no longer want to ask who is looking at me, but instead begin to ask what within me is being reflected, leave a word in the comments. Mirror. Sometimes simply daring to recognize the mirror is enough for the journey to begin shifting. Chapter 6. Solitude. A necessary condition to encounter the self. Number 5. Solitude. A necessary condition to encounter the self. At the moment you stop believing that all the eyes around you are focused on you, life suddenly slows down in a very strange way. The noises that once crowded your mind gradually recede, and in that settling silence, you begin to touch a familiar state that has long been avoided. The feeling of solitude. According to Carl Jung, this is not a step backward, but a sign that you are moving closer to your inner center. Jung viewed solitude in a completely different way from the common human fear. For him, solitude does not mean abandonment, lack, or social failure. Solitude is sacred space where the soul can finally speak without being drowned out. He once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." When you have lived too long under the gaze of others, you rarely truly hear what is important to yourself. Therefore, withdrawing from the crowd is not escape but a necessary condition for inner truth to appear. When you are constantly reacting to the opinions, expectations, and emotions of others, the self has no space to coordinate life. You may function very efficiently and integrate well, but inside there remains a quiet space that has never been touched. And precisely because of fear of that quiet space, people often cling to busyness and constant interaction as a way to avoid it. Imagine solitude as a lake in the early morning. When the wind blows, the surface is constantly rippling, reflecting distorted and unclear images. Only when the wind calms does the surface become still, and the image beneath begins to appear. Psychological life is the same. When you are always surrounded by the voices of others, you only see fleeting reflections. But when you dare to be alone, no longer reacting, deeper layers of yourself begin to emerge. Silence does not create the true voice. It only allows that voice to be heard. A very typical story is the journey of Steve Jobs during the period when he left Apple in the 1980s. When he was pushed out of the very company he founded, Jobs entered a phase that outwardly looked like failure but inwardly was a profound withdrawal. He slowed down, traveled to India, practiced meditation, and reflected on what truly mattered to him beyond fame and recognition. It was during this solitary period that many core ideas about design, simplicity, and intuition took shape. When Jobs later returned to Apple, he was no longer chasing trends or noisy competition, but working from a clearer inner center. From a Jungian perspective, this is a classic example of solitude becoming the space where the self is restructured. What makes many people afraid of solitude is not being alone itself, but what will surface when there is no one left to distract them. In silence, avoided questions begin to appear. True desires, unnamed sadness, and inner conflicts once covered by social life begin to demand attention. Jung considered this necessary because only when you dare to stay with these contents do you have the chance to integrate them rather than continuing to project them outward. Focus only on yourself does not mean cutting off relationships or denying the world but temporarily withdrawing attention from others in order to re-establish inner order. You do not need to disappear from society, but you do need periods of silence deep enough so that you are no longer pulled by comparison or judgment. When you are alone without trying to fill the time, you are giving the self the opportunity to coordinate your life again. Forgetting others here does not mean being antisocial. On the contrary, it is the only way to return to the center. When you no longer need others to validate you or serve as a backdrop for your identity, you begin to stand more firmly in interaction. You do not cling, overreact, or lose yourself in relationships. True solitude does not distance you from people. It allows you to be more fully present when you return to them. When you can be in silence without panic, when you can be alone without feeling lack, that is a sign that the self has begun to take its place in your life. And from that inner foundation, you return to the world not to seek, but to live. Not to be seen, but to be present. Not to chase anyone, but to walk in alignment with the deepest rhythm of yourself. Chapter 7. From extroverted ego to a disciplined inner life. Number 6. from extroverted ego to a disciplined inner life. According to Carl Jung, this is the profound turning point where a person stops being pulled outward by the world and for the first time begins to build a disciplined inner life. Not the discipline of force, achievement, or proving, but a discipline born from a very deep inner need, what Jung called inner necessity. Jung never encouraged blind action or frantic doing in order to feel valuable. He clearly distinguished between action driven by the extroverted ego and action rooted in the inner core. When the extroverted ego leads, people act to be seen, to be recognized, to be favorably compared. Life's rhythm is then dictated by external feedback. But when action arises from inner necessity, you act because something inside demands to be realized. Even if no one sees, no one praises, and no one understands. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." True discipline cannot come from a universal formula. It only appears when you listen to your own rhythm. Imagine a disciplined inner life as a tree with roots growing deep underground. The roots are not visible or impressive. Yet, they determine whether the tree can withstand storms. If you only focus on feeding the leaves and shaping the canopy to look good, the tree may appear fine until the first storm arrives. Jungian discipline is not about making the canopy of your life more impressive, but about returning daily to nourish those invisible roots in silence. I once met a man named Leon who worked in finance and was accustomed to a fast pace and goals tied to recognition. After a period of burnout, he decided to slow down. Strangely, he did not rest completely, nor did he launch into a dramatic self-improvement plan. He simply began very consistently waking a bit earlier each morning to read, writing a few lines of reflection and focusing on the single most important task of the day without telling anyone. No one praised him. No one knew. But Leon noticed he was calmer, clearer in his decisions, and less swept up by external pressure. He did not become better than others, but more aligned with himself. And from that inner anchor, external effectiveness followed as a consequence, not a goal. From the perspective of modern science, this also has a clear basis. Many studies on self-regulation show that intrinsic motivation is far more sustainable than extrinsic motivation. When action is driven by rewards, surveillance, or evaluation, the brain quickly becomes fatigued and requires higher levels of stimulation. By contrast, when action is tied to personal meaning and inner coherence, the nervous system maintains a more stable state of focus. Jung described this phenomenon early on in the language of depth psychology. Psychic energy flows long-term only when it serves the process of becoming oneself. Focus only on yourself at this stage is no longer turning away from the world, but establishing a new order of priorities. You invest in yourself not to surpass others, but to avoid betraying what you know to be true for you. You may do less than others, move slower than others, but each step carries weight. This discipline is often lonely because it does not produce a compelling story to tell. There are no immediate achievements, no applause, and precisely because of that, it remains undisturbed. True growth from Jung's perspective is almost always silent. It does not resemble a breakthrough, but a quiet accumulation. Each day you choose to do what is necessary without being pushed. Each time you keep your word to yourself in very small matters, you strengthen your inner center. And when that center becomes solid, you act in the world without being dragged by it. When inner life is disciplined, you no longer need excessive external control. You do not have to force yourself to try harder because the energy is already there. You do not need to prove because the direction is clear. And it is precisely then that you realize a very Jungian paradox. The more deeply you focus on yourself, the more steadily you are present in life. Quiet and showy, but with weight. This is the discipline no one sees. Yet it supports your entire life. And if these lines touch you in a very calm way, not explosive, but enough to make you pause and look more deeply at your own rhythm of living, press like on this video. Not as an external response, but as a small sign that you are choosing to listen to something very real inside. Sometimes even such a silent gesture is a form of inner discipline. Chapter 8. Withdrawing energy from the world. Stop seeking validation. Number 7. Withdrawing energy from the world. Stop seeking validation. So what happens when you have built a disciplined inner life yet still feel as though you are waiting for the world to respond? When you are no longer chaotic, no longer chasing comparison, no longer reacting blindly. But somewhere inside there remains a very subtle movement. The wish to be acknowledged, to be seen, to receive confirmation that you are on the right path. According to Carl Jung, this is not a failure of the inward journey, but the next stage of ego maturation, the moment when energy truly begins to withdraw from the world. When the ego is immature, it needs reflection to know that it exists. Praise, attention, and positive feedback from outside serve as mirrors through which the ego takes shape. But Jung believed the ego is not meant to remain in that state. As the ego matures, it no longer needs the world to constantly tell it that it is okay. It begins to stand on a different foundation. Inner unity. At this point, value no longer comes from how much you have, how many people recognize you, or where you stand in social order, but from a deep inner sense that what you live, think, and do are not in conflict with one another. Many people confuse focus on yourself with egoism, pride, or withdrawal. But from a Jungian perspective, withdrawing energy from the world is not turning away from others, but stopping the use of them as a source of your sense of worth. When you still need validation, it means a portion of your psychic energy is still flowing outward, waiting to be returned in the form of praise or attention. And as a result, your emotional life remains externally regulated, even if you appear independent on the surface. I once knew the story of Anna, a woman who had moved beyond comparison and was no longer overly afraid of judgment. She had a relatively solid inner life, worked steadily, and did not chase an image. But whenever she shared a personal project, she still unconsciously checked for feedback. Not because she was weak, but because a part of her was still asking, "Is this good enough to be seen?" When she noticed that very subtle movement and stopped, not by forcing herself to be indifferent, but by returning to the inner feeling of working, a quiet shift occurred. She no longer rose or fell with others' reactions. The work remained the same, but her emotions were lighter. She did not lose motivation. She lost dependence. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. To fully accept yourself means you no longer need anyone else to bear witness to your value. This is frightening for an immature ego because it is accustomed to being nourished by feedback. But for an ego that has passed through sufficient experience, this becomes liberation. You no longer need to prove because there is no longer any part inside demanding reassurance. Imagine psychic energy as a stream of water. When you constantly seek validation, that stream flows outward, spreading everywhere. When you withdraw the energy, it does not disappear, but seeps into the ground, nourishing the roots. No one sees the water underground, but it determines whether the tree survives drought. Inner value is the same. It does not need to be displayed, but when it is deep enough, all outward action becomes stable. Emotional independence in Jungian psychology does not mean needing no one but not being shaken by whether others respond or not. When the self begins to coordinate life, your emotions no longer rise and fall with external gazes. You can receive praise without excessive excitement and criticism without collapse. Not because you are numb, but because the center of regulation has shifted from outside to inside. Focus only on yourself now is no longer an effort. It becomes a natural state. You do not need to try to forget others because when energy has been withdrawn inward, others naturally lose their influence. You are not concerned with proving you are right. Nor do you need anyone to confirm that you are on the right path. You know, not intellectually but through a deep sense of inner coherence. And this is a very particular moment of psychological maturity when you realize you are no longer living to be seen. Not to be recognized but not to betray what you know to be true. The world is still there. People are still there. But they no longer hold authority over your inner life. And in that very quiet withdrawal, a rare form of freedom appears. A freedom that does not need to oppose anyone or surpass anyone because you are no longer standing on the same axis of measurement. When you reach this point in the journey, you may realize that focus only on yourself was never an act. Chapter 9. Conclusion. Of rebellion nor a cold withdrawal. It is a very quiet return, a silent shift of the center of living from outside to inside. No longer needing the world to confirm who you are. No longer needing others' gazes as proof of your value, you begin to stand on a different foundation, inner coherence. From that point, life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes true. You no longer have to live fast to keep up with anyone, live correctly to be accepted, or live big to be seen. You only need to live in alignment with what is moving most deeply within you. And paradoxically, it is precisely when you stop seeking your place in the world that the world no longer has the power to shake you. If this video makes you pause for a moment or touches a very familiar feeling you have never named, share it with someone who is also tired of living under others' gazes. And if you want to continue the journey into inner life, subscribe to the channel.